He paraded around town dressed as a zombie hunter, like something straight out of a comic book. Everyone loved it. He even posed for Halloween pictures with police. Little did they know, he was a cold-blooded killer for real. You see, the zombie hunter never hunted any zombies. Instead, he ran down 2 defenseless young girls and stabbed them in the back. This is how they finally caught Bryan Patrick Miller. Let's recap. The day before Angela Brasso's 22nd birthday. She lives with her boyfriend in Phoenix, Arizona, in an apartment complex near the city center. And they're not far from the bike trail. It's a scenic route along the canal that runs through the city. Though Angela and her boyfriend use it a lot. It's good, safe exercise. Around 7 p.m., Angela takes off for a birthday bike ride. But instead of joining, her boyfriend stays behind to bake her a surprise cake. But Angela never gets the chance to take a bite. When an hour goes by with no sign of Angela, her boyfriend gets worried. They always watch In Living Color at 8 on Sundays, so where is she? He goes out 3 times that night looking for her, but Angela is nowhere to be found. So the following morning, police walk up and down the bike trail until they make a grisly discovery. They notice a puddle of dry blood and they follow it off the path. It leads them to an open field between the canal and a city park. And in the middle of that field, they find a headless female body stripped down to her socks and shoes. She's been fatally stabbed in the back and sexually assaulted. She has wounds around her genitals and a cut across her sternum. According to a detective who worked the case, it looked like someone tried to cut her in half. The only thing missing were her bike and her head. 11 days later, a man was fishing in the canal when he noticed something stuck on a grate. Angela's severed head. The strange thing was the head was well preserved. It didn't have the kind of decomposition you'd expect after 11 days in the hot Arizona sun. Detectives figured her killer probably kept it in a freezer as a trophy of sorts. Well, it didn't take long for Angela's case to turn ice cold too. There were no witnesses and no identifiable marks on her body. They collected foreign DNA, but its owner wasn't in the system. The technology didn't exist to narrow down a suspect's DNA through family members. 10 months later, on September 22nd, 1993, another body appears in the Phoenix Canal. High school junior Melanie Burness went out for an evening bike ride the night before. When her mother came home from dinner, Melanie and her bike were missing. The following morning, a local woman is riding the trail with her daughter strapped in the back seat. They splash through an odd-looking puddle, and it's too thick to be water. So she circles back, and she notices the puddle is red. Blood red. And then she sees marks leading to the water as if something had been dragged. Now those marks led to Melanie's lifeless body floating in the canal. She was wearing a child-sized blue bodysuit. Whoever killed her stole her clothes and redressed her. Like Angela, she'd been stabbed in the back and sexually assaulted. Melanie's head was still attached, but the letters WSC were carved into her torso. DNA on her body matched the sample taken from Angela's body. The same person killed both of them. Well, newspapers named him the Canal Killer. Police questioned all the usual suspects, but they could never find their man. But weeks became months. Months turned to years. The bad guy eluded police for over 2 decades. In that time, he got married, he had a daughter, he got divorced, and he became a local celebrity known as the Zombie Hunter. He'd even posed for pictures with Phoenix officers, the very same officers who were trying to track him down for murder. His name was Bryan Patrick Miller. He liked to run up and stab women in the back, especially if they looked like his mother. Bryan sure was mommy's little monster, and he may have gotten away with it if not for his ego and advancements in genetic DNA sampling. Well, Bryan Miller was born in October 1972. He lived with his 18-year-old mother, Ellen, and his father, Paul. They lived with Paul's parents in Michigan for a while, but they moved to Hawaii when Bryan was 5. Paul, sadly, was killed in a motorcycle accident around Christmas that year. Well, Bryan always associated his father's death with the start of his mother's abuse. Those who knew Ellen called her explosive, angry, two-faced, or, as one neighbor so eloquently put it, she was a bitch. So she and Bryan lived near Honolulu. Bryan tried playing with the neighborhood kids, but he was shy and he kept to himself. He lived in constant fear of his mother's fists. They moved to Phoenix when Bryan was 10. That's when the abuse grew into physical, mental, and sexual torture. According to experts, Ellen exposed Bryan to violent films and pornography. She basically melted his young brain, giving him a distorted view of sex where violence, blood, and intimacy are just all wrapped up and together the same. Ellen was not the kind of mother they make greeting cards for. When Bryan was a kid, a visiting family member remembers him coming home from school one day and his mother starts berating him over some missing cookies. But it's not, "Oh, Bryan, how could you eat those cookies? I was saving them for the church social." No. It's more like, "Bryan, I know you took those cookies to school and traded them for sex." Ellen was a corrections officer at a local prison. Everyone knew she was a strict disciplinarian, but they didn't think it was that bad. But it was that bad. It was worse, probably. Bryan spent Christmas 1987 at an inpatient facility after running away from home. Family therapy was a condition of his release. The counselor described Ellen as angry, vulgar, disinterested. During one session, she seemed more upset with Bryan than usual, so they asked her what was going on, and apparently Bryan had carved vaginas into Ellen's collection of Barbie dolls. There's so much to unpack there. Sex, knives, violence, and women, to Bryan, one didn't exist without the other. And you probably will not be surprised to hear that the canal killings were not Bryan's first violent acts. So to tell that story, we have to go back to March of 1989. A 24-year-old Celeste Bentley has just gotten off the bus at the Paradise Valley Mall. She's heading into her shift at one of the mall department stores. And a 16-year-old Bryan gets off the bus right behind her, sprints past her, and disappears. So just as he runs by her, Celeste feels this shooting pain in her back. She reaches behind thinking, "This little creep punched me." But when she looks at her hand, it's covered in blood. While Celeste is in the ambulance, police manage to track down Bryan. He changed his clothes, but Celeste still recognizes him. So Bryan goes back to juvie, where he stays until his 18th birthday. But before he gets out, his mother comes to the police department with this very strange note she found in his dresser, and it is titled "The Plan." And it details step by step how Bryan wants to kidnap, tie up, violate, and kill a woman. Well, that was enough for Ellen to wipe her hands clean of her son. She was no doubt remembering all the terrible things she said and did to him. She doesn't want him coming home, so he moved into a halfway house instead. Now, let's fast forward a few years to 1992. Bryan lives in a rent-free apartment controlled by the Paradise Valley Mennonite Church. He's allowed to stay there on the condition that he work or volunteer with the church, also getting counseling from the church on personal hygiene, basic skills. Well, he's baptized into the church in May of 1992. And it's around that same time that 13-year-old Brandy Myers goes missing. Brandy is a skinny blonde girl with big glasses. She has a slight learning disability. According to reports, she's more like a 9 or a 10-year-old than 13. She was last seen around 7 p.m., not far from where Bryan was living with the Mennonites. She was going door to door collecting pledges for a reading project at school. That's when she allegedly knocks on Bryan's door. Brandy was never seen again. Her body has never been found. Police didn't have a shred of evidence until Bryan Miller told his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amy, a disturbing story from his past. He said a girl matching Brandy's description came to his door selling Girl Scout cookies in the early 90s. He invited her inside and then attacked her. He wanted to preserve the body in the bathtub with cold water, but he accidentally turned on the hot water, speeding up the decomposition process. That's when he chopped her up and stuffed the body parts in garbage bags. Bryan kept the bags in his apartment until trash day, which was long enough for the smell to waft through his neighbor's wall. They complained, but Bryan insisted it was just bad meat. Is it ever bad meat? If your neighbor is telling you it's bad meat, you better call the police. And those who knew Bryan said the smell coming from his home was worse than rotting food. It got so bad they had to hold an intervention of sorts. So while Bryan was out one day, they went in and cleaned the place from top to bottom. By then, Brandy's body was gone, and all evidence of her being there was erased. 7 months later, police find Angela Brasso's decapitated body. By 1993, Bryan was living with a roommate he met through work. They became good friends, going to concerts together, riding bikes along the canal trail. So in September, when Melanie's body appeared on the trail, the roommate joked about Bryan being there. And Bryan shakes his head. He's like, no, I wasn't there. I was riding on the east side that night because Melanie was found on the west side. So remember how Melanie was wearing a blue bodysuit that wasn't hers? Police released a photo of it, hoping that it would jog someone's memory. Bryan's roommate saw the picture and remembered seeing it in Bryan's things. Why he owned a child-sized blue one piece was anybody's guess. But he mentioned it to somebody else who anonymously tipped off the police. The report, along with Bryan's note about his diabolical plan, went into his file, but that's all they had. But Bryan met Amy in 1996 while volunteering at St. Vincent de Paul. She was 19, never dated before, wanted to be a teacher. 2 months after their first date, Bryan proposes. She says yes, and the soon-to-be weds shared their first kiss. Now, a new red flag went up every few weeks. Amy was very religious. She wanted to wait until marriage to, know each other. But Bryan was persistent. He begged and begged, and he got his way. Well, Amy's grandmother kicked her out of the house when she found out. And they got married fast in 1998. But money was very tight. Amy's pregnancy made it tighter. They moved into a home in Washington State where their daughter was born. In 2000, while living in Washington, Bryan allegedly crossed paths with 14-year-old Victoria Michelson. She was walking to school along a bike trail when a man stabbed her from behind. So she fights her attacker and she gets control of the knife. He promises, I won't hurt you anymore if you just let go. So when she obliges, he stabs her twice more before running away. She would have bled out on the trail if not for a bystander who police believe scared her attacker off. Doctors had to remove 18 inches of intestines to save her life. The knife also came within this close of her aorta. Years passed and a suspect never materialized. 15 years later, as police circled Bryan, they showed Victoria a picture of the zombie hunter. And she said she was 95.5% sure that he was the man who nearly killed her that day. Unfortunately, the statute of limitations had lapsed and there was nothing that she could do. In 2002, Bryan was arrested and accused of stabbing another woman. It was only then that Amy learned the real reason why he was in juvie as a kid. Well, Bryan claimed the 2002 stabbing was self-defense. The woman was trying to rob him at knife point, he said. He wrestled the knife away and stabbed her in the back. She said he simply walked up and stabbed her unprovoked. Who do you believe? But it was a he said, she said for 8 months. Bryan waited in jail the whole time, writing these sexually explicit letters to Amy about using knives and needles in the bedroom. A jury acquitted him, and he came home to fulfill his fantasies. So, bedroom time took a scary turn. Bryan held knives to her throat. He even cut her slightly. It was too much. Amy came to fear her husband. So they divorced in 2006. And Bryan won full custody of their daughter in 2010. By then, he'd gotten involved in steampunk cosplay, and he fell in love with Comic-Con. The zombie hunter was born. He wore goggles, a helmet, this long trench coat, and he drove around in an old-school police car. It was actually kind of cool looking. Besides the fact that he was an actual killer. It was covered in fake blood, had the word zombie hunter printed on the back. He'd pose for pictures with police officers and parade goers. And meanwhile, the Phoenix Cold Case Department was hunting their own serial killer. Their first major break came in 2014. A genealogy company offered to help with the Canal murder cases. Though using the DNA they recovered from Angela and Melanie's bodies, they were able to narrow the list down to 6 people named Miller. Bryan Miller stood out among all of them. He was the only one with a past record and opportunity to kill these 2 women. And he was right under their noses as the zombie hunter the whole time. When he wasn't being the zombie hunter, Bryan was packing boxes at an Amazon warehouse. Police tailed him, hoping to get a sample of his DNA. They needed it to match the sample found on the victims' bodies. So they came up with an elaborate ruse. A detective, posing as a security consultant, approached Bryan on his break. He said there had been a series of break-ins at a building nearby, and he was wondering, does Bryan want a part-time gig as a security guard? Well, Bryan does want a part-time gig. He loves the idea. Maybe he'd get to wear his zombie hunter outfit while on duty. He's all over it. So he agreed to meet the security consultant at Chili's to fill out a job application. But secretly, the police worked with the Chili's staff to make sure that they saved anything Bryan might touch, because all they needed was just a small DNA sample. So Bryan shows up with his 15-year-old daughter. They order burgers and water, and the police knew they had their sample when Bryan finally took a sip. And the results come back 11 days later. Bryan's DNA matches the DNA found on Angela and Melanie's bodies. He's arrested and charged with first-degree murder. When the police showed up at his house to search the place, they found a nightmare. His home is like something you'd see on Hoarders. Just garbage everywhere. There were these little paths you could follow between the kitchen and the TV, like the bathroom, the essential rooms. Otherwise, it was just trash piled up to the ceiling. Apparently, those Mennonite lessons in personal hygiene did not stick. But Bryan went on trial in 2022, 30 years after Angela Brasso's body was found. His lawyers admitted he killed her and Melanie, but they blamed his mother and pled insanity. A psychologist said Bryan suffered from dissociative amnesia, which made him forget traumatic events. His lawyers claim Bryan had no memory of killing those women. That's why he denies it to this day. But the judge didn't buy it. Since Bryan opted for a bench trial, there was no jury to convince, and the judge found Bryan guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. As of 2023, Bryan Miller is sitting on death row in Florence, Arizona. He still says he's innocent, with no idea how his DNA wound up on those bodies. He's never been charged for the murder of 13-year-old Brandy Myers. Her case is still open to this day. But I'll tell you this, if she comes back as a zombie, Bryan Miller better be the first person she eats.
And that's your recap.
Thanks for hanging out with us today.
If you like getting all the crime in half the time, go ahead and tap that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a story.
We're here Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, but don't go away. Catch up on more recaps right here, right now.
Until next time, take care.